Hello and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool, and today we are speaking about women, women's histories, and the erasure of women's histories in South Africa, but particularly in the Cape. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Professor Prof Bam, who is the director at the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and is also the author of the book Ausi Told Me, Why Cape Herstoriographies Matter. And we'll also be joined by Shihaam Domingo, who is a creative producer of food stories focusing on indigenous food history. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short video that was held to celebrate women and their heritage. Let's have a look.
Your footsteps walked that path and you came now to what is called Princess Flay. So there's a story to this flay, which is the story of our heritage, which belongs to us. It's the story of the land. And we're going to have a very special storyteller who's going to come and tell us that story.
First, let's salute you for taking that walk. From where did you walk? From Sunrise. Music back to Princess Flay. Come on, queens, give it up for yourselves.
Women must now bring the missing element of fire and holy communion with thee, reclaiming the matriarch, taking up place, space and voice. Only then can the whole of humanity truly rejoice. Thank you, Mama Elizabeth Kelly.
We are broken in our souls, broken souls, broken souls. Don't let go of yourself.
And yet, we ask, does our color mean right? And our black mean wrong? But what I know, you can call black in many ways. You can describe it in bloodiness. But as a black woman, we are strong for your words. We are brave. And we are the rock that doesn't break. And black stand for who we are. Black stand for our roots in our koikois. Black, it's me, it's you, it's us. Black is beautiful. And a black woman is beautiful.
This is about access to information, because access is power, and the power is in the relationships. So we need to wake up and build our relationships so that we can access the power that we have, because we have it, we're just not using it. Much love, peace and respect, and we hope to see you again next year. Blessed love. Hey, to you. Love all around.
That was a short video from the Matriarch March that was held to celebrate women and their histories. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about women's history and also the erasure of that history. And joining me in studio, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Prof Bam, who is the director at the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and Shihaam Domingo, who is a food witch, also known as creative producer of food stories with a huge emphasis on history. Ladies, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. And thank you for having us and hosting us, Lenina. And hello to the viewers as well.
I'm so excited to have this conversation because being a woman myself and understanding that we don't necessarily see ourselves in the history pages, something that often we only realize much later on. I'm excited to be having this conversation and that this literature, we're going to be speaking about the literature, exists. But I wanted to start the conversation with a random fact. Now, in 2012, about, almost 10 years ago, about 10-ish years ago, there was a Twitter thread that went viral. It was the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, and and I don't know if we call them millennials or Gen Xers or whatever, but anyway, a lot of people came on and they said they didn't know the Titanic was real. They thought it was just like fiction, the movie. And I remember I was so fascinated by this, and I thought it was so funny. And I went to my youngest brother and I said, "Can you believe these people think the Titanic never happened?" And his response was, "What? The Titanic really happened?"
How young is he?
So, and he would be in that category. But so I sort of wanted to start with, just looking at history. Why, and Professor Bam, if you can speak to us about why is history so important for humans, for our identity, just for, even for survival?
Understanding our past, it's part of understanding exactly why we are human. And so part of being human means having rituals, having a deep understanding of how to survive, having to understand why the ecosystems and the natural environment and why those things are so important for our survival as humans, and how we survive that, and how we should not repeat those mistakes. Because if we know that at a certain point in time, for example, there were epidemics, 1700 smallpox in this part of the world, then there were women who had certain knowledges about maintaining, containing, sort of kind of the resistance to fight and the natural immunity to be able to resist pandemics and epidemics, etc. And those knowledges never went away. Come COVID, for example, people, because we're not aware of those natural ways of doing things to build up immunity in the plants around us, because they've been erased. And we also don't listen to women, right? Because history is written predominantly by men, and our history in particular by white men. We had no idea. I mean, they came from Europe, came here, observed people, and wrote our past for us. Completely erasing the women of the Cape from their perspective and their realities. And so what we have in the history books is the sense of people who are vacuous, women who are just sex objects, and they're just good for labor, and they're savages, and they don't really have any knowledge of value for the world and for what makes us survive as humans, and what's important for that in terms of our health. And so our children, if they're deprived of that sense and understanding of humanity and our link and place in ecosystems and in the landscape of why we have to look after the fynbos, why food security is important, who looked after food security, which plants are edible and inedible in this landscape, then things can go horribly wrong, and we can have pharmaceutical industries and all kinds of people exploit and use and kill off further. So 1912 with the Titanic, which is quite interesting that you mentioned it. At the same time, what was happening, I mean, very few people would be able to tell you that, in fact, at that time, you could go on a hunt and hunt Bushman people. You could get a license and go for a hunting expedition at the same, in that year of the Titanic.
To hunt people?
Yes, at the Cape, yes. You could hunt at the time when the ANC was formed in 1912. You could go on a Sunday afternoon with your license, as of course a person from Europe, and hunt people and kill them and bring them back as part of your expedition into the veld. And often those expeditions into the veld, and this is particularly in the northern regions happened at the time, were when women were doing the activities that Shihaam is teaching, which is to dig out the uintjies, which is a protein, a bacteria, as part of food security for thousands of years with the children. So if you do not have the opportunity to study history and learn from history, and especially women, her stories, you'll miss out these important points of understanding our present and why it's so important not to repeat those very same things when we destroy ecosystems, etc.
Thank you. I mean, it's just like so sobering to bring, I think, that fact into the conversation, into the room. And I want to say, one of the things, because I was reading obviously a lot of little different things about your work and your research, and I remember one of the things that stood out for me was that Europeans would come to observe the indigenous people, natives, as they called it. So records pulled from them, but sort of observed. There was a very zoo-like quality to this.
That's right, exactly. So from Sarah Bartman, already 1800s, it went right through, and it didn't just stop with the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. It continued. And even though the enslaved people were liberated at the Cape, so-called liberated, 1834, and then as apprentices, 1838, the actual zoo-like expeditions, the zoo-like parading of people, the putting people on display, digging out graves and looking for body parts, sexual organs. Somebody from Europe orders a penis or whatever of a bushman, and they can get it, right? It's like a package. So those things all continue long after Sarah Bartman in around 1810. It goes right on, and you're talking 100 years later, you could still go on a hunt. And that continues, so that human remains of graves that got dug out are taken to universities for race sciences. We're talking 1920s. So, so the Titanic happens, and the students, the youngsters don't understand that this is real. And at the same time, they also don't understand that there were so many other horrific things that were real of their own people. And so once we center the women's knowledge of the landscape and plants and food security, all these stories come to light. Because what happened? How come there was this erasure of the landscape and the plants and the knowledge of women? And what happened to them? And then those stories should come out.
Thank you. I mean, what's valuable is also the understanding, I guess, of how history is recorded and how it is written. And so understand, you need to understand that in order to understand the erasure.
Yes.
But I, because you brought up the food security, and Shihaam, you and I met because we were talking about food security and the type of food that you were, the stories that you tell about the food. And I'm just going to come in because, this show was born out of literally one conversation that was, Shihaam was just talking about how food is all around us, how there's edible food in the form, edible plants all around us. But that you will still find people literally digging in bins next to food that they can eat. But I'm not saying it the right way. Shihaam, I actually wanted to ask you, you know, to give us more context around what you do in terms of food and storytelling.
Well, for me, firstly, it's a constant journey, and I just want to acknowledge Ausi June in being integral in that journey for me and that understanding.
Can I just add, so I forgot to mention the very special relationship between these two women. I should have said it at the beginning. So Professor June Bam was Shihaam's history teacher many years ago
At Grassy Park High.
at Grassy Park High in Cape Town. And so Shihaam also, you know, when we conceptualized the show, Shihaam was talking about coming full circle and where she is now in terms of what she's learning and the stories that she's telling and how food is related to history in her work and the role that Professor Bam is having in that now.
Yes.
So it's just, you know, I was quite excited by that relationship.
And there's consistently been, I just have to also acknowledge that at high school I was quite a delinquent, failed 2 years in a row until I landed up in Ausi June's class and said to me, and it was around an essay that I had written, and she called me in and said, as long as you're able to justify what you are writing, I'm going to give you marks for it. It flipped education for me completely. It made me want to understand better. I went from being a delinquent to being on the SRC, being the spokesperson for the school, because I then engaged differently with what I was doing. And it was thanks to that guidance. What then happened was Ausi June was taken away from us in my matric year. Other teachers were calling me comrade and what. But I was told when I asked where she had gone, because she just disappeared. They said, no, she went to write our history books. And that got me excited because I couldn't read these books that I felt like didn't make sense. And I think there it was already where I established this thing about how I take information in. I also had a problem with reading because I was moved from from being left-handed to right-handed when I was 6 years old. So reading in itself and now having to read something that I can't accept became more difficult. But yeah, so that's what happened. And we didn't see each other for many years. We saw each other swiftly at the screening of the Kratoa film, which was traumatic. But then again, seeing you there and that acknowledgement of this was what we just saw was not right. It also enabled me to stand in speaking out even stronger. It was like to be in that moment here as somebody that really knows what I'm feeling and has the information to prove that what I'm feeling here of what has just been presented is not right. Then fast forward to me stalking Ausi June literally on Facebook, and just watching from a distance like that, like what this teacher is doing, and now a professor at the university, and I landed up in Betty's Bay during the lockdown because I was in entertainment industry, and it was wonderful for me because there I had the chance to really connect with the plants again. Before this, I would only go once a year, and there's a standing joke in my home where my husband and children know that when we're walking outside and we're having conversation, I will just disappear because then I'm talking to the plants. And to them, it used to be a joke that I talk to the plants. And it was that thing of you can't pass something, you've got to engage with it and find out who it is and at different seasons. So that was something I started doing in Betty's Bay, these full moon walks. And it came from also stalking what Ausi June was talking about. And then in that time, the book Ausi Told Me also came out, and I was about to do a full moon walk and really wanted to have the book there. And when I contacted Ausi June, she said, no, but I want to come. And it was wonderful because it was so perfect, because a part of that process for me was also landing people in the space that are knowledgeable about the space that they live in. And there's a gentleman called Ibi Hall that works at the Botanical Gardens. So Ibi Hall before this was my guide, because if you ask anybody in Betty's Bay and in the Overstrand, Ibi is the guy that knows the most about the plants. He spends his off days going to propagate in the mountain to ensure that the buchu is still growing, that the seeds are where they need to be and whatnot. And as it happened on the day that Ausi June came, Ibi just didn't pitch. he had a medical emergency and I couldn't get hold of him. And we started the walk, and I was quite nervous, but because my teacher was there now, and now I don't have the knowledgeable person there. I just know the little that I know, and I'm very comfortable with the ocean because that's where my love for cooking started also, and foraging. Um, and as we walked into this, before we even started at the parking lot, so we do an acknowledgement of the space and the ancestors of the space, and Ausi June immediately started, and the walk was the most incredible walk I ever had. Of that space that I walked so often, because right there was the first plant tabakbo she taught us about, and how it was a woman, it was a plant that women smoked, and that would be, and what it would be used for, and so the journey went down that path, and that path began to look very different for me to what when I did it with Ibi, because Ibi knew the Latin names, he comes out of the botanical gardens, and then hearing it this way from a woman, more of the medicine was coming through of the plants. It was literally that stretch of walk is a pharmacy right there. That was what you also said in one section of it. So that learning was, sure, I can go on forever, Lenina, about and about this. But what was also beautiful for me, and that excited me, is a part of our ownership of Afrikaans again, the way that the plants and their names says what they are a lot of the time. And the one plant I learned there was Holstokbessie. That is now my favorite plant to reference because it says exactly what it does. And I mean, I've walked past that berry so many times, or where the man would have called it, they called it Draver. It was like Bessie Draver, a kind of a grape. But he didn't know what the use of it was. The medicinal use of it was. And when and how to look at it in its different phases. And what you can use differently with it in the different phases of the plant. So that has been a beautiful part of the journey, and the coming back. And in the book, Ausi Told Me, like I said, reading is really difficult for me. But that book I keep next to my bed and I read it over and over. And if like now I've loaned it out to somebody, and I can't wait for it to come back, because I just loan it to you and I go like, read one chapter and then you must go buy your own book.
Yes.
And that's what they do. They do go and buy their own books. But it was just, I can read it over and over because it relates to the space I'm in. I live right next to Princess Flay. So a lot of the story, and just, I can picture everything as I'm reading it. It doesn't feel like an academic book. I struggle, especially with reading academic work. But this doesn't feel, it feels like our story.
And I think that's the difference, is being able to also see yourself in that story and understanding. And then also, I think, in terms of what Professor Bam said about also seeing your history in that story, right? And seeing it written from a woman's perspective, because the other thing is, aside from the fact that who the history was written by, it's also that it is from male perspective, which we are going to chat about, but we need to take a short break. So we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about women's history and also the erasure of that history. And still with us in studio is Professor June Bam, who is the Director of the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and Shihaam Domingo, who is a food witch, as we said before the break, but also a creative producer of food stories. And so we've been having this really great conversation about our histories, also a really sober conversation. And Professor Bam was also telling us why it is so important for us to remember our histories, how it's connected to identity, how it's connected to survival. And so, Professor Bam, on that note, you wrote a book called Ausi Told Me, Why Cape Herstoriographies Matter. And I just want to pull up, you said herstoryographies, because I tried to even Google that and it didn't come up. Her story came up, and as a definition, it was history viewed from a female or specifically feminist perspective. And so I wanted to provide that context, because we're not just talking about the history of women, we are talking about the history of women as told, as recorded and told by other women. And so, Professor, I want to come into the second segment just asking you to tell us about the book.
Thank you, Lenina. So the book Ausi Told Me, which means Ausi, and you'll hear Shihaam says Aus, she chooses to do that. Because Aus means the knowledge keeper, the one with the knowledge, the older one. And this term is still very much on the Cape Flats, in the Cape, but people sort of recognized it or thought of it as something from Afrikaans, as Aus, Oudste. There is a connection, but it's actually a Khoi Kowap word, Ausi, Ausi. And when the Dutch East India Company came to the Cape, and even before that, they heard this word, Ausi. And you still find it on the Cape Flats, but nobody made the connection. So it is a strong, it's the wise woman, the mother, the knowledge keeper, the one who carries on the knowledge of the plants, the massage, the healing. So you'll also hear a lot of Cape Flats people know about Itzmir, and they'll speak to baby and the Kwaivant, and these things are deep. It's a very, very ancient knowledge and practices and rituals at the Cape that were never recognized as part of our stories and our histories. Because, historiography means the form and methods of writing history, but of course his male perspective. And so we've got European historiographies of our past. And so it's about Jan van Riebeeck, 1652, the Castile, and even when men, black men, indigenous men, attempt to rewrite our past, they still write it from a very male perspective. So it's about the battles or political histories, structural histories. It's not about the women's way of knowing and interpreting the past and writing that past. You go to Robben Island, you still find very much the male history. You won't find Krotua, yet she was so integral to that history. You won't find the women, the wives. You'll find a little bit the Jetty one, of the political prisoners, the Winnie Mandelas and so on. But you won't find the ancient, the women's history of Robben Island there. And that is what I'm advocating for, is a herstoryographical focus, which means from the women's perspective, women as a collective from ancient times. And these women carried, and anybody from the Cape Flats can go home and ask, even the gangsters fear Ausi. If you go into the township, you just have to say, we're going to fetch Ausi, or Santa Ausi, how? Oops. Because she had that kind of respect and power, which got erased with colonialism. As she became objectified, as she became a domestic worker, as she was taken away from a landscape and a knowledge, her pharmaceutical knowledge of 150 years at the Cape, that knowledge is sitting somewhere else in Europe, in the archives, in the universities of Leiden and so on. And professors over there became the botanists of the world. It's the OC knowledge of this area, of this region in its diversity. So Ausi told me why Cape Historiographies Matter. Historiographies Matter. I did it that way to really trouble the masculine, patriarchal, Eurocentric histories that we have, and to focus it on that deep history before Van Riebeeck, that's been here for thousands of years. Dasypus, which is, the rock rabbit, the urine and the feces that become a crystal after 40,000 years, and a medicine in the mountains. When the Europeans came here, they watched and they knew that the Bushmen had this knowledge of this medicine and the rituals and stuff. So for thousands of years, that was for neurological diseases, etc. Certain plants that were used for high blood pressure, all of those things that we now find with the Rastafarians and with the street and what they call the bush doctors, they practicing that, but it's coming on for thousands of years. And so we all grew up with these medicines in the morning before you go to school for your immunity. And the massage and knowing about the wind and how it blows, watching the birds, watching the insects, knowing that if you disturb the ecosystems, we one day going to have big trouble. We're going to have hunger. We're going to have disease. We're going to have conflict. We're going to have murder because people can't survive. And they don't know anymore how to survive. So the book are these stories of the Aussies. The book cover is this totem and this triangle of ostrich shell. It was given to me by Adri from the South African Sound Institute. And it was when my mother was passing over, was an Aussie. And she taught us from very small. I had no other knowledge. Until I went to school, I discovered other book knowledge. But from small, we were taught about the plants, and we were taken into the veld to be taught, and so we know these things. So I can go into the veld and I know those things. It's an archive, and to respect the insects and watch their movements and be able to interpret that, and also to know the stars and their significance, and to know the movement of birds and the water snake and all of these things. And the big myth is in white scholarship, we were discussed as people who died out, we extinct. You know, that is, the smallpox came around, and then these people just died out. And what we do have is Cabo, who was held at the Breakwater Lodge in Cape Town, near the waterfront today. And so some linguists and anthropologists came over, and they archived that knowledge of the stars, astronomy, and so on. But, you know, these people no longer exist. They were wiped out. And that's a big myth. And so there must be the right to that education of Ausi Told Me. And men, I've worked with a number of men as well, with all these knowledge holders of what Ausi told them. So George Bedwell, for example, there's this deep knowledge about the landscape and plants and what is where along the coast and in the mountains. And the respect when you take out a plant and you respect it, and the roots, because you have to keep the ecosystem intact. And so the Ausi was teaching all these things, coming on for thousands of years and being passed on. And, you know, there was also the integration with the Indian Ocean and the people who came with enslavement, and even before, because at this part of the world, there's been a connection with the Indian Ocean, with the Phoenicians, and so on. And so there's this myth that there was no contact. But we know that through Ausi, because Ausi has this deep knowledge of the landscape and climate change, which predates the 1600s by far, and which shows a connection with what we know about the Indian Ocean and about the Phoenicians. And so my book is about positioning that knowledge as decolonial, real knowledge. And so when the library at University of Cape Town burns out and only the Cabo archive is salvaged, and people say, oh, now we have that history. Goodness me, we saved that. That is also a myth, because that real knowledge has been going on for thousands of years at the Cape, on the Cape Flats and beyond. And so that is what my book is about. And that is why I've got the triangle and the ostrich shell on the cover, and the totem of the triangle as that telepathic way of knowing beyond the conventional, beyond the books and stuff in the archive, knowing on the wind, knowing through the nose and the senses, knowing through the plants. And that was what my teaching was when I used to teach Shihaam and others so many decades ago. And I'm so proud and honored to have Shihaam in this conversation.
And I'm sure that's what made the huge difference. I mean, I love also that you're bringing in sort of, I was trying to find, you know, the piece, there was a piece, a description of your book that was speaking about that history is questionable. And we are often taught at school, I remember we are taught there's one way, this is history and it's set in stone, and this is just the way it is. And actually, a lot of our education system doesn't allow us to question. I remember I tried to question, and you get shut down really, and so you learn to accept the status quo, and you learn to accept things as they are. And so what I loved is that bringing in this, not just bringing in this questioning of what is recorded history. Yes, ongoing question of what is recorded history, whose history matters, how also we speak about not just written but also the oral history that is passed down, and we can speak about that a lot. I wanted to come back to what you said about where are my notes? About understanding the sort of the disturbances also in the ecosystems, what a lot of this has told us, and how that is going to lead to poverty and conflict and disease, and we do already see
We already see the devastation.
Yes, and so just going to poverty and food security again, Shihaam, to come to you, what you do then is then also carrying on this work is going out there. You literally forage, right, for edible plants. You'd literally find them, and for medicine, use this in your food. But then you must be deeply aware, as you've made me, of how we don't know that. I didn't know this knowledge sort of existed. I didn't know the scale and the scope of how much food is actually out there on my doorstep. Is that right?
It is. I mean, I was just one of the things that as when I came back to the city, I was busy with a decolonized meal for the Embassy of the Netherlands at the castle, and as driving into town, there was a dirt bin. And there was a man scratching in the bin for food. But the first thing I saw was the bitterbessie. The plant was blooming, and the plant also gives berries, which makes an incredibly nutritious juice, as I've been taught by Ausi June. And this man was scratching in the bin, and there was the most nutritious fruit right next to him, and he didn't know. And it is a man that is brown skin and probably of Khoi descent and would have had an Ausi in his life, but didn't know that there was medicine and food right next to him. And for me, that is an awakening also, to go like, we think that if we can get it out of a packaging, if we can get it off the shelf, that it's good for us. And if it's sustainable and all of those words, that it's good for us. But if we're getting it directly from the environment, that is how it's good for us. That is how it's good for the environment also. There's no packaging, no carbon footprint. And for me, that's an important part of the journey in what I'm doing now, is showing that. It was recently being asked to provide nourishment for an important event around Kritoa, and then having to have a conversation with that university and saying like, nourishment isn't a soft drink. That's not what I do. I don't do a soft drink or anything bought from a shelf. I have to know where I am getting the produce from, how it is being made. I have a mandate also that everything that I do now is also women holding those spaces, women taking care of the environment, women that are working with the environment and harvesting from it in an economically viable way, but also sustainable for the space that they're in, but that come from heritage practices. So it's been so beautiful, that conversation and those linkages that are happening. It feels like the stripe or the circle, like Ausi June said, it's getting tighter, and you feel more held because there are more people talking about the knowledge more, and more conversations around that rather than what is trendy in the shop and on sale at the moment.
I love that. And so we're socialized, right? We're socialized. And I see the erasure in the knowledge when we look at sometimes. I was reading, I was really trying to remember an article that I had read by someone who said that to them, growth and progress had meant deliberately turning away from sort of the old indigenous knowledge and going to see a doctor. So we'll see some, and there were women, there were mothers, there were heads of households, there were grandmothers. Progress to them looked like Western medicine. And so
Formula.
and formula
Giving
and
formula.
refusal to sort of engage with the land. It's something that really does need deeper unpacking.
And with your body and the gifts of your body,
Yes.
of what we can do for each other in touch and in healing without commercial medicines and whatnot. The touching yourself, touching each other, we've lost that because we think you've got to go to somebody that studied at a university and is part of a commercial system.
Yes, exactly. But also, with the forced removals, people were removed from that environment of the plant for massage for the baby, the medicine for the fever. I mean, it was the pharmacy. And so people were dumped into concrete blocks and townships and they have been removed from the ecology. They've been removed from the ecosystem that gave them mental health balance, the rituals. So they don't know when the August frogs will fall anymore, because the August frogs used to fall. And then you used to know this is August, and then the babies will come out. And so that's all gone. You used to look at, you were taught to look at things within your, the plant that comes up and what it will mean and so on. So you now rather take that plant out, which is the medicine plant, and you're taught to now, because you're ashamed of your indigenous knowledge. And the OC was never ashamed of her knowledge. She was just marginalized, invisibilized into domestic and factory work and all sorts of things with industrialization and colonialism. And you'll plant a tulip from Amsterdam in there. And so what has it done to us? So that is decency. That tulip, that rose from England, it's our sense of decency, our sense of what is good for us, of what is beautiful. But it's actually what's been erasing us and taken away who we are.
And I think that brings us back to sort of, how we decide. I think, how do we decide what is legitimate? I'm sorry, this is bringing up so many questions for me also, just in the way, you have these questions and you think about what has been sold to you as knowledge and what has formed your worldview in terms of where you want to go and what do you want to achieve. I have some memories of seeing my grandmother eat a flower and being like completely shocked that you can eat a flower because it is so foreign and weird, and going to my friends, my grandmother eats flowers, but not knowing anything about that, or not knowing, wanting to buy the roses, because that is
and
what
I like
is
roses, by the way.
No, I'm sure, and nobody's slamming roses, but I think what we're just saying is like what we've seen and what that means for us, and what
counts for us,
what counts
what
for
we've
us,
learned,
exactly.
what counts in the world. What we wrote out a book before this was whose history counts.
Yes.
So whose knowledge counts, and before that, indigenous knowledge reinterprets Southern Africa's women. Reinterpret Southern African pasts, but it's all about those things. And even how we look at time, how we look at dreams, how we look at visions, this is seen as superstition. These things are not superstition. They are the real knowledge. There are things, that happen.
We
and
have
tell
to
us
take another break, ladies. But we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we have been having an absolutely fascinating conversation about women, women's history, about the history of food, about our indigenous history, and also the erasure of history and women's history also specifically. And so I'm still here for some last words from Professor Prof Bam, who is the director at the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and Shihaam Domingo, who is a food witch and a creative producer of food stories. And so, Professor, I think I'm going to start with you. We want to get some last words. I'm thinking just about how we can think differently about history, one, and then also how we can get hold of your book.
Okay, thank you, Lenina. So I think we need to have confidence in what we know, all of us, everybody, because the main archive is outside of the formal archive. And that archive resides with the people in their rituals, in their belief systems, in the deep knowledge of the landscape. And so it's that knowledge that we need to center and have confidence in. And Ausi must come back into the classroom. There was a time in the 80s when we had the community in our classrooms. We need to bring Ausi back into the classroom and that respect for Ausi so that Ausi is not burned and raped and killed and all sorts of things that have been very worrying in this male patriarchal violent society that we've become because we've erased Ausi from the archive. And so Ausi has always existed there, so that erasure attempt has never really happened fully, as we call epistemicide. There was an attempt to do it, and it started with colonialism. And we've inherited that, and we've actually allowed that to thrive instead of making Ausi a positive part of our future for sustainability, for peace, for healthier communities. So Ausi's got to come back, and we need to protect our environment, our floodplains, we need to look after our bees, and these are all things that were taught by Ausi. And so my book particularly zooms in on the wetlands, a place called Rondevlei and Hartevlei, where Lavendale is today. And so what do people know? They know the sad story of Ella Pakis, who strangled her son to death because of drugs, because it's such a violent area today, because of forced removals. But before there was Lavendale, there were these food gardens. And Ausi was an important part of the food gardens. And it was a vibrant, very mixed, diverse African community. And then people were parceled out to different parts, on places on the Cape Flats, Manenberg, Langa, Guguletu, all over. And they split, and they started to believe that they were separate people and that they must fight one another as separate people. And so my book hopes to tell the story of how, when we listen to Ausi, we realize, just how mixed and integrated communities were now. They shared with livestock and all of those things. And it was never that kind of society that we've now inherited. So my book is available at Exclusives in all major bookstores. And yes, I do hope it can engage more stories from the people and all the knowledges that it's sitting there. The knowledges are sitting there and they're waiting to come out. Yeah. And hopefully there will be more books like Ausi Told Me at the Cape.
And I'm sure I also saw it's available on Kindle also.
Oh, it's on Kindle, okay.
I'm sure. Oh, I stand under correction. I must go check, but I'm sure when I Googled it yesterday, yes, it said, you can download the Kindle version. Yeah. So I was very happy to see that. Okay. And I must mention that Ausi Told Me also won the 2023 National Institute of Human and Social Sciences Best Non-Fiction Monograph.
Non-fiction monograph,
yes, award,
category.
Which is fantastic, right? Which is also really legitimizing. And I said to the professor this morning, I was watching something else where we said, yes, women are the first to say, it's not about the awards, but it is about legitimacy. And I think it's important that what this tells us is it's legitimizing on a broader level for all of us. It's recognizing women's history as important, which is what the book is about.
Yes, thank you. Yes. There were other winners, of course, in the awards, but I think what it does is to center this very important collective story and new stories and understandings of knowledge outside of universities.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Shihaam, I'm so sorry, I have 2 minutes. And so I also wanted to bring sort of the question to you, because I'm sure as soon as anyone engages with you, they're like, oh, my word, how can I follow this path? how can I better, eat better food? How can I increase my knowledge about all of this? It's last words. It can be anything, but how important is it for us to engage deeper?
I think it starts with just acknowledging the space that you're in, acknowledging what is growing in that space and what is alive in that space. Learning about it, like really start talking to the plants. And start talking, going to find the Aussies in your community, go speak to your aunties. There are aunties that know in your family. Like there must be an auntie that knows about your grandmother and why she ate those plants.
Yeah.
Go and ask those questions and then teach our children about that.
Yeah. So thank you so very much, ladies, for joining us. I'm sure that this show is going to have ripples far and wide. And thank you also very much for joining us. That's all that we have for today. That brings us to the end of the show. Goodbye.